Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and Happy Neutrality Day 2023. Let's start with this one. It is officially the day of neutrality, 12th of December, which was in 2017 elevated to an official UN day, whatever a UN day is. But the United Nations recognizes now the importance of neutrality in the international system. So, Happy Neutrality Day, everybody. Now let's switch to the actual, to me, big news of today. When I opened the New York Times, I read this article that I thought, wow, it's only 5 months late, but even the New York Times is now admitting that the defeat or the failure of the much hyped counteroffensive of Ukraine. You know, that thing that had been announced to us like since a year ago, and then we were waiting for like 5 months, half a year. Then it started, and it became clear within weeks that it is not destined to achieve this very rapid victory, and going to the Black Sea and then taking back all of the Ukrainian territories. It became very clear that it is transforming into a very bloody war of attrition. And now, on December 12th, or maybe it was yesterday in the US, December 11th, the New York Times admits that US and Ukraine search for a new strategy after failed counter-offensive. And this article is very long and very detailed, and it's highly interesting, not only what it admits, but also the kind of mindset that it portrays. Again, let's go through a couple of notes here. It starts with American and Ukrainian military leaders are searching for a new strategy. Yeah, because you got to do something, right? Can have that happen. And, Mr. Zelensky just was in the United States. And obviously they were not just talking money, they were also talking strategy. The push for a fresh approach comes after Ukraine's months-long counteroffensive failed in its goal of retaking territory lost to the invading Russian army after weeks of often tense encounters between top American officials and their Ukrainian counterparts. Oh, really? So there have been tough encounters. So we know now, it has been absolutely clear that the United States is in the driving seat, but now it's getting more, there's a little bit more admission of this entire situation, right? Ukraine's setbacks have come as Republicans' support for continuing American financial assistance for Kiev has eroded. So, New York Times actually very conveniently blaming the Republicans that they are withdrawing their money, that now, these big setbacks are setting in, and that if we just gave more money, if these evil Republicans gave more money, then probably the counteroffensive wouldn't have failed. That's the implication. The paper doesn't say that, but that's clearly what the implication is. And then, of course, the onslaught of good old Joe Biden. We can't let Putin win. Of course, this has to be emphasized. And the next part, then, giving a little bit of Russia bashing, the Russian military after its own failed drive to Kiev in 2022. So the New York Times is still pretending that what Russia was trying to do in early 2022 was to take over Kiev, when obviously, clearly, utterly, the strategy in the first 2 months or so, up until the end of the Istanbul negotiations, was clearly to scare Ukraine into actually doing that agreement, that neutrality agreement, that would demilitarize, not demilitarize, but that would make Ukraine off limits for the United States and for NATO, right? But the New York Times still pretends that the idea of Vladimir Putin was to take over Kiev and take all of Ukraine. So that pretense is still up. So Moscow now has more troops, ammunition, and missiles, and has increased its firepower advantage with a fleet of battlefield drones, many of them supplied by Iran, according to American officials. So New York Times, okay, saying on the one hand, all of the propaganda that we've been feeding you over the last 1.5 years that Russia is running out of ammunition. I mean, reversed here, okay, Russia has a lot of ammunition, but at the same time, still saying it's actually also the fault of the Iranians. You know, we're all aware that Russia is incapable of producing its own ammunition, so it must come from the outside, right? Because as we are feeding our ammunition into Ukraine, which is not able to produce its own military goods, it is absolutely clear that Russia also must be failing at the very thing we're failing at, and therefore um, let's just blame another one of the enemies that the United States has chosen to have, Iran, and just say that that is their mistake that Russia is not running out of ammunition, which is ridiculous. We know that the Russian in the industrial capacity and military complex can like outpaces the West by leaps and bounds, and it is clear that Russia is producing these things by themselves. But okay, let's leave that aside. The United States is stepping up the face-to-face military advice it provides to Ukraine. Yeah, stepping up the face-to-face military advice. It's advice, ladies and gentlemen. It is not orders. It is not. It is not telling them what to do. It's just advice. But it's stepping up the advice. I mean, how often haven't we all wished that somebody steps up the advice, and that we're given more stepped up advice? And just the pretense becomes harder and harder and harder to digest this. But okay, fine. The Ukrainians want to go on the attack either on the ground or with long range strikes with the hope of seizing the world's attention. I mean, it's talking about how the Americans and the Ukrainians have different ideas what they want to do, but that the idea of the Ukrainians, according to the New York Times, which must know very deeply of the thinking of the Ukrainians, that they want to attack. And I find the framing so interesting, right? This is this is fascinating that according to the New York Times, what the Ukrainians want to do is to attack more with the hope of seizing the world's attention. I mean, if they said with the hope of seizing Crimea or with the hope of seizing back some land, I would understand the sentence. It would make sense to me because there would be a military goal. But here, the framing of this is that the Ukrainians want world attention, not necessarily, they don't necessarily want any kind of gains or victories. And I think this is quite revealing, because what we have seen over the last 1.5, 2 years is a stage play, especially from the Western side, right? Everything is geared towards telling a narrative, from having a professional actor being president, who was acting before, who was even playing a president before being the actual president, all the way to the green sweatshirt and everything, all the way to the press releases and this glorification of Mr. Zelensky and Ukraine, and also the weapon deliveries. Everything is geared toward convincing Western a Western audience that what is happening is right. So, and even here, apparently, according to the New York Times, the Ukrainians still want to keep convincing Western audiences that what they're doing is right, is good, and seizing the world's attention. Right? This is fascinating. It's like it's to me, it's revealing of what the entire game is about, and that this acts of violence then, and this continued onslaught is not aimed necessarily toward fulfilling a military purpose. It's aimed toward us, the propagandized audience, to keep financing this endeavor, right? The stakes are huge. I love steaks. Very juicy ones, and medium rare. Without both a new strategy and additional funding, American officials say Ukraine could lose the war. No, really? Wow, Sherlock. Honestly, I always thought Ukraine is fighting on its own, and it is up to only Ukraine that is actually fighting. But well. We are learning new things every day. We're also learning that already 111 billion US dollars have gone from US taxpayers to smoke and death and destruction and carnage in Eastern Europe. Many Ukrainian leaders do not realize how precarious continued US funding for the war is. American officials said. These Ukrainian generals and senior civilian officials have unrealistic expectations about what the United States will supply, they said. So now apparently anonymous senior US officials are like blaming the Ukrainians for not being realistic. All right, that's the famous blame game that also the Iran and so on is talking about, which has definitely begun. American officials say Ukraine will have to fight on a tighter budget. Okay. No more fancy weapons. It's now going to be budget weapons. They're not going to come straight from Lockheed Martin. They're now going to come from Walmart. All right, Ukraine. Ukraine's self-sufficiency, and that's a mistake. I apologize for this one. Let's scroll a little bit further down. Ukraine has not released official numbers of its war dead, but the losses officials conceded have been steep. This article is really interesting because it mixes like a lot of things of revelations that have been clear to anyone who was following the war with a clear eye, and admits all of these things to the general public, to the propagandized public, and then it mixes it with a little bit more of like blaming A and B and trying to pretend that there's some form of serious analysis going on. But this is also an interesting admission, right? Coming now in December 2023, that actually, we were told that the Russians are the ones doing all the bleeding and the Ukrainians are the ones doing all the winning. And now suddenly we are learning that it might be the other way around. Senior American officials said they are open to some of Ukraine's new ideas. Okay, good. We have new ideas. What are they? US officials said that Ukraine's deep strikes into Crimea this fall proved deadly to Russia and were a bright spot in an otherwise disappointing counteroffensive. American strategists believe the Ukrainians can build on that success next year, even if much of their energy is spent on rebuilding their forces. Okay, I mean the needle pricks. These needle pricks that have been going on that were very costly for Ukraine because unless you can achieve the needle pricks with some long range missiles, they need to be done by people who actually go on very daring missions, and a lot of Ukrainians who are killed in these missions. But apparently those needle pricks are a light at the end of the tunnel for some weird reason. But then the article gets even more interesting because now parts of the new strategy are being revealed. The Pentagon has decided to dispatch Lieutenant General Antonio A. Aguto Jr., who commands the support for Ukraine from a base in Germany, to spend lengthy periods of time in Kiev. So another one of these admissions, so that the advice that the Americans are giving to the Ukrainians is coming directly from high-ranking military from the United States, and that these people are now going to be involved even more deeply, because until now they were operating from this colonized part of Germany, that military base there probably in Ramstein, right? From where then all the orders went to the Ukrainians on what to attack and where to go and so on and so forth. And now apparently these officials are going to get more involved and going to spend more time in Kiev. I guess this signifies more escalation, more direct involvement. I mean, we have seen that in the Vietnam War, where everything started just with military advisors, right? And there were a lot of advisors, although all of these advisors were like clearly like boots on the ground in South Vietnam. And then the advisors were increased over time until full-scale involvement of US troops fighting in the North Vietnam 50 years ago, right? So here we don't seem to be at that level yet. I mean, we're talking about only the most high level military personnel, but that personnel is not going to be directly involved, probably in the command centers of Kiev. So one speculates who then still has the high command of the Ukrainian forces, if it's really still Soluzhny, or if these people are actually going to start running the show more directly. That could be an implication of this, although I doubt it, because the strategy still seems to be, of course, to let the Ukrainian do the bleeding. the Americans and the West, NATO is not willing to sacrifice more than a couple of volunteers who want to go and fight, but they are not stationing their own troops, and this seems not to be changing. If they started stationing their own troops, and if their own troops started dying in Ukraine, that would of course mean that we're inching much closer to a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia. So the West seems not to be willing to go all the way yet, and I hope they won't, because that the level of carnage would increase dramatically. General Aguto frequent relations in and out of Kiev would inch toward the end of the current restriction that there's not that many American boots on the Ukrainian ground. And then they start talking about the Battle of Rabotine and how that unfolded, and actually start admitting that it was all a lie, because Rabotine was sold to us as this place where Ukraine starts winning and gains back territory. But Russia's defenses proved far stronger than the United States had assessed, and rather than a victory, Rabotine turned into a bloody slog. So admission that it didn't work, and that all of this fanfare was actually just that. It was just wishful thinking. The 47th Brigade, Ukrainian 47th Brigade, one of 9 trained by the United States, took huge losses. Scores of soldiers hurt or killed. Also new language to me of actual admission of really high losses. So it seems as if the collective net West now needs to really explain to the general public why reality as they are seeing it on the ground is actually kicking in. So you have to start massaging the message in, and the idea in, that things didn't exactly turn out the way that we've been pretending that it was turning out the entire time. Winding a little bit back the clock, but then again, who remembers what these papers were writing like 6 weeks ago, right? Politics is the art of controlling the current 6 weeks, because anything that's older than that is history, and nobody cares. So they're now changing the narrative of the current 6 weeks. For 3 months, US and allied military personnel trained the 9 brigades, 36,000 Ukrainian troops, in the basics of maneuver warfare. The theory advanced by American strategists was that only a heavy force could punch through hardened Russian lines and retake Ukraine's southeastern coastline. But while the United States taught Ukraine how to use the weaponry, the Russians dug in and prepared for the coming fight, as all serious analysts have been saying ever since spring, that the Russian fortifications are formidable. There were 3 lines. There were more. There was very. This is what the Russians have always been good at. I mean, all the serious strategists and analysts have been saying this cannot work. Even Mearsheimer in summer came out with a wonderful analysis of when such strategies work and when they don't. The blitzkrieg approach to rapid advancement in order to overwhelm an enemy, it usually doesn't work. It works. It usually fails, like historically, and he wrote this beautiful piece about that. But well, and that's just a theoretical approach. We have all the other analysts like Alexander Mercouris and Alexander Christoforou, and of course the Scott Ritter, who were saying, look, the Russians are really, really deep dug in. This is going to be extremely difficult. And yeah, well, they proved to be wrong. But while the United States taught Ukraine how to use the weaponry, the Russians dug in and prepared for the coming fight. US and Ukrainian strategists did not initially realize how much more Russians were strengthening their defenses. Okay. So the problem was not that one didn't know. The problem was that the Russians were better at this than anticipated. Well, okay, all right. The deep Russian defenses included more formidable minefields than seen any time since the Korean War, and all technology that slowed and stopped the advancing Ukrainian army. What they mean by old technology, I don't really know. I guess that's just like one of these little ways to soften the blow a little bit, to just say like, okay, the Russians, they don't have new materials, but they use old materials quite well. I mean, like kind of a nodding to them, while not admitting that Russia is just capable of very sophisticated warfare, which is what you need to admit after a defeat like this. Ukrainian military leaders have said they believe the American exceptions were unrealistic. And we're back to the blame game, right? We are blaming again. So both sides claim each other's views are unrealistic. There are a lot of reasons why the counteroffensive failed, but the Ukrainian critique has some truth to it, said Eric Caramella, a scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. There was kind of collective expectation inflation. Really, the West inflated its expectations. Honestly, wow. US officials point to Ukraine's successful and damaging attacks on Russia's Black Sea Fleet. Again, the same, the little pinpricks, right? That to say like, okay, not everything was a failure. And then get this. It was, some officials said, a major naval victory by a country without a navy. We're back to creating some stupid slogans, this stupidity like, okay, Russia is the second strongest military in Ukraine. Stupid stuff like that, as if though a couple of attacks on like the Kerch Bridge or one or two sunk Russian military boats actually constitute some form of naval victory. So we are still not out of fantasy land. Just fantasy land gets like reformulated a bit, and you can see how these journalists are trying to somehow soften the blow, right, by still feeding in some of these ha 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 moments. Yeah, it's going to be our victory in the end, but this won't do very much, because this article like admits that at some point you need to talk about reality. Ukraine does not need to claw back. Oh, new strategy. Ukraine does not need to claw back all of the nearly 20% of the country it has lost to win the war, American officials say. Scoring some strategic and symbolic victories while strengthening their defenses and build up their own abilities to produce more weaponry could be enough to strengthen Ukraine's hand when calls for peace talks to end the war inevitably restart. So this is really the height of ignorance, saying of ignorance and bloodthirstiness, saying that instead of immediately calling for negotiations with the Russians and say like, okay, Ukraine, you've lost this war, you've lost the offensive, you've lost the war, you need to sit down, and we, the Americans, we need to sit down and seriously and in good faith negotiate with the Russian a security agreement, the way that they wanted to do it before the war in December 2021. Instead of doing that, the new strategy seems to be to continue supporting Ukraine with what it needs to gain symbolic victories. So blowing up every once in a while a tank of the Russians or a bridge of the Russians, or maybe an ammunition depot or something, in order to then wave the victory flags and say like, look how good we are, while their military continues to get annihilated. And by military I mean young men and more women who gonna do the dying in order to get some strategic some symbolic victories, right, with only the one intention of strengthening Ukraine's hand when the inevitable peace talks, even the New York Times admits that peace talks will be inevitable. And if you say that there will be peace talks, what you mean is that you didn't win the war, right? Even the New York Times says probably there will be negotiations, but now we just need to prolong the war a bit longer in order to increase Ukraine's strategic bargaining power, instead of already going to peace negotiations and actually admitting defeat and see what you can achieve with the Russians negotiating at this point. So this is as horrible and as warmongering as it gets, my friends. Last sentence: if Ukraine and the West make the right investment in pursuit of a long-term strategy, then Ukraine may retake the advantage. So, okay, as hopeful as this article is in like the collective West admitting realities, it still ends in dream world. So it seems to me as if though we are caught, the West is caught between like what it has to admit and what it still would love to be reality, while obviously not having the political support for that anymore, or the will to fight this war. But at the moment, you just let the Ukraine you let them continue bleeding and bleeding out, with the hope of a few more Russians dying in the process. And I mean, let it keep it going for as long as necessary. And of course, we would need to talk also about like the whole timing with the US elections coming next year, but this is still so far away. Anyhow, this is where we are at this point, on the 12th of December, the day of neutrality. There's still no neutrality on the table for Ukraine, although it seems the more to me that India and also Ukraine, what's left of Ukraine, there will be some form of neutrality involved, mark my words, in what's going to come next in one way or the other. But we are not there. We're not at the end, and people continue to die. People have to die because there's no willingness yet to start the talking. Happy Neutrality Day. See you next time.